It's time to accelerate. Hey friends, this is Andy. Welcome to episode 633 of Accelerate, the sales podcast of record. I'm honored to be joined on the show by my guest today, Jane Gentry. Jane is the principal at Jane Gentry Company. She's a sales growth expert, an executive coach, global keynote speaker, and an expert on relationships. And in this episode, we're going to talk about relational intelligence. I mean, you've heard of emotional intelligence, EQ, sales intelligence, well, sales-specific emotional intelligence called SQ. Now there's RQ. And we're going to explore why it is absolutely vital for people in sales and in business in general to continue to build and get better at building authentic relationships with customers, peers, colleagues, and so on. I mean, authentic people, sort of defining what authenticity is, authentic people admit they don't know everything and that they might not have the right fit for the customer, which are great trust-building steps. We also explore the skill gaps in building relationships and talk about how the fundamentals of relational intelligence, such as vulnerability, humility, teachability, open-mindedness, and empathy, can be taught. As always, a ton of great takeaways for you here today. If you'd like to see the show notes for this episode, go to andypaul.com/633. I have been mentoring and training sales professionals for years now. And as I've been talking about over the last several weeks, what I believe is one of the most important elements to career success is aligning yourself with a company that develops its employees, values their customers, and has a portfolio of products that compete with anyone in the market. With its recent acquisition of Level 3, the new CenturyLink is a world leader in providing cloud, security, real-time communications, hybrid IT, and managed services. So if you want the excitement, challenge, and rewards that come from selling industry-leading services to the enterprise, and if you're looking for a fresh sales challenge to take your career to the next level, then check out CenturyLink.com/accelerate. That's CenturyLink.com/accelerate. Join their talent community. And you do that, then a member of their team will reach out to you to connect and see if a career at CenturyLink could be the right step for you. And before I talk with Jane, let me remind you that if you haven't yet signed up to receive my periodic emails, then you're missing out. I say some of my best advice about sales, leadership, marketing, relationships, resilience, character for my subscribers. So visit andypaul.com. Right there on the homepage, you can fill out a simple little form and subscribe. All right, let's get to it, Jane. Jane, welcome to Accelerate.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Great to have you here. So I start the conversation usually with a standard question that I ask all my guests, and we'll have you answer it today. And that is, in your opinion, what's the single biggest challenge facing sales reps today?
I think the biggest challenge is trying to navigate technology and traditional relationship building. There's so many different ways to connect with a customer anymore that I think it's confusing for a lot of sellers who go way too far one way in terms of only thinking that technology and social, for example, is the only way to build relationships. And then there are those kind of old schoolers who, are that kind of only face-to-face, and you can't build authentic relationships in technology. And there's this really important middle ground that is difficult to navigate and figure out how do we build authentic relationships in whatever format that looks like.
So what's the middle ground?
The middle ground is a combination of those things, but we fall into these into these traps with technology, Andy. I think that we used to fall into, I'm a little bit older. I don't think I'm old, but
You're saying,
back in the day, where as young salespeople, one of the mistakes that we would make might be to ask for something way too soon, right? When the relationship wasn't at the right point, when we hadn't invested enough in the customer, those kinds of things. And today, I see some of those same errors just on technology. I mean, I can't tell you how many LinkedIn emails I get with a pitch for something that if they spent 5 minutes on my website or 30 seconds on my website, they would know that I'm not a great candidate. And as a matter of fact, Barb Giamanco is a respected colleague.
Mm-hmm. She's been on the show.
Barb and I also are members of Women's Sales Pros. She's great. Social selling is her thing. And she wrote a post the other day about somebody sending her this whole pitch about helping her with social selling, which is just ludicrous because she is Miss Social Selling. So, so there's a kind of a middle ground. And the idea is that we have to continue to build authentic relationships. And that's a term that just gets used so much that it's almost losing its meaning. But until I come up with a better word, that's the one I'm going to give you.
Well, how would you define authentic? Because you're right. That's the word that people use more frequently these days. So what is an authentic relationship?
Yeah. So I was telling you a moment ago about this lunch I just left with a potential client, a senior vice president of sales. And she was telling me about the process that they all went through to try to understand different mindsets of customers, different kinds of personas and things. And I said to her, well, that's really fascinating. What's your persona? What came out for you? And she said, she really started talking less about communication preferences and more about character preferences. And she said, I'm really frank. I don't like when people don't answer questions and they're vague and they beat around the bush. And I feel like they're trying to manipulate the situation somehow. And authentic is a word we use a lot with leaders too, which really just means to me, can you be vulnerable? Not weepy, talking about when your dog died, that kind of vulnerable. But I'm talking about, can you be willing to acknowledge
that could be fine too.
Huh?
I said that could be fine too. I mean, there's nothing wrong.
Maybe at the right point in the relationship,
yeah.
Right? But are you willing to acknowledge that you don't know everything? And for a salesperson, that you might not be the right solution for the customer, which is totally okay. Are you willing to be teachable? Are you willing to let the customer be the expert? More and more, our customers are more versed than we are. For salespeople that aren't catching up on that, customers continue to get smarter and smarter. So are we teachable as a salesperson? And are we willing to be that same person with a seller or that we are with everybody else? Or do we feel like we have to put on some kind of a persona? It's no different than when I keynote. I tell speakers, people don't want to see a speaker, and I'm making air quotes. I know you can't see them, but people want to know you. Audiences want to connect to you, not whatever you think a speaker is supposed to look like. And clients are the same way. They want to know who you are. And so I guess that's what I mean by authentic.
Yeah, and I vulnerability, humility, and I think those are two really important ones, sort of, first cousins. Teachable, open-minded, empathic. I mean, these are things that sort of fundamental skills. So again, sort of before the show started, you were talking to one of your clients, and they're talking about training this idea of becoming more effective relationship builders to the most junior employees, right? The new ones coming in, those coming fresh off college, and so on. And oftentimes when I talk about this with a number of guests on the show, and also in talking to clients out in the world, is that a lot of people are focusing on this, and I wonder, it's like, are kids being raised differently these days? That because these are really human skills. These aren't necessarily business skills. These are human skills.
Yeah.
Where we're doing a disservice to, like I said, the younger generations. We're just not teaching them as they are raised and socializing them so way to be able to build these relationships. Yeah.
So I was just with a bunch of senior leaders on this very topic, and they asked the same question that you did, and the answer is yes. They have been raised differently. And it's almost like we just let technology loose. We just let technology out of Pandora's box with no boundaries or no understanding as to how that would impact us. as a culture, how it would impact relationships. And it has had a dramatic effect on what I would consider the next generation, so millennials and the generation behind them. And so what the result of that is that this younger generation, while they are so bright and so collaborative and so motivated and such a creative generation, they have enormous skill gaps around social intelligence, or sometimes I refer to it relational intelligence, because marketing companies have hacked that term social intelligence to refer right to intelligence you get off the internet, and that's not what I'm talking about.
Right.
There's a high rate of anxiety in those generations around things like face-to-face conversations. And so, the exciting thing about that, if there is an upside to that, Andy, is that those are skill gaps, right? So they're easily solvable. And that's what I'm trying to get through to leaders. If you get past the biases and the myths that you have about millennials, about how lazy they are, and, I don't listen to that stuff, so I don't know half the other ones, but, all those kind of common biases that we have around that age group, if you can get out of your own way there a little bit as a leader to do a couple of things, it'll make a huge difference in your sales organization. And the one is, I think, is to assume a positive intent. So the knee-jerk reaction of leaders, in my experience, around this age group, is that when they do something differently, when they want to use technology differently, when they want to work different hours, the knee-jerk reaction of leaders is to say they're lazy, or they're this, or they're that. And so the first thing we have to do to make a difference as sales leaders to this generation is get the heck out of our own way and realize our own myths and biases about those generations. Once we do that, and that's not a simple task, is to realize that we have to lead differently. So these things are really, you say they're people skills, and they are. And so the solution to these is not just sales organization specific. These are culture conversations that we're having, right?
No,
we're talking about culture changing, and changing culture has to start with leaders. And so that's really when we do work with organizations to help them figure out how to assimilate. And, millennials on the top end are 35, so we're not even really talking about millennials anymore. But to start to assimilate these younger people into the organization, although they always ask, can you help fix the millennials? The answer is always no. We always start with the leaders. And so that's one thing, is to get out of our own way. The second thing is to realize that some of the biggest challenges that we have with this age group are, as I said, they're literally skill gaps, which to me is great news, because it means that they're trainable. Those skills are coachable and trainable. Some more difficult than others. For example, the ability of college students to empathize has dropped 40% since 2002. For sales leaders, that should be super scary.
But
I don't know how you sell if you can't empathize with your customer.
Yeah, I was going to add to that, though, is because I saw similar data, but I think Jeff Colvin quotes it in his book, Humans Are Underrated, saying that, I think it's Oxford Group or somebody has done a survey since 1979.
Yeah.
And the empathy of graduating seniors, college seniors, has dropped continuously since 1979. So it's not necessarily a millennial issue. This is something it's
continuing.
It's
and
continuous.
The study that I'm referring to is at a University of Michigan.
Right.
So that means we have two different studies that kind of validate that.
Yeah.
That to me is a frightening statistic. And when I speak to groups of millennials in sales, it's interesting. When I first started speaking on this topic, I I speak to groups that are very diverse in terms of age and experience. And I was pretty convinced that millennials were going to toss stuff at me, like their shoes or pretty much whatever they could get their hands on. And what I find is the opposite. I find that they say things like, Jane, you're freaking me out how you're in my head right now, So they understand that they have these gaps. They're anxious to get development to fill these skill gaps. And they're looking to leaders to help them do that. And the topic of empathy in particular is interesting because I think by and large, the groups that I've talked to, they get that they have a gap here. And they'll say, can you teach me empathy? And, that's a yes and no kind of an answer to that question. Simon Baron Cohen, who's
maybe
the cousin.
Maybe Sacha Baron Cohen did as well.
He's related, actually.
Yeah.
They're cousins, I think. Simon Baron Cohen is a researcher out of the UK doing a lot of work on empathy, studying empathy. And so there are two different kinds of empathy. There's cognitive empathy. In other words, am I able to listen to you, watch you, read the signs of what your face is saying, what your body language is saying, what you're saying verbally, and can I identify what you're feeling from the signs you're giving? That's cognitive empathy. And then there's affective empathy, which means I actually give a crap. So, I say to these young people, yeah, we can teach you cognitive empathy. We could teach you to react appropriately to the signals that your customer is giving off. I can't teach you to actually care about your customer. But, sometimes it's that situation where the more you do something, the more you become that thing, right? So I think there's probably evidence to show that the more we act empathetically, the more we become empathetic.
Well, I think it's a learned skill. I mean, I think it's a habit you get into, and I think that if you want to follow a certain progression, a process, if you will, when when there's a situation that triggers the opportunity to be empathic or empathetic. I mean, I know there's a lot of dispute about which is the right usage of the word, but there's a choice you can make in that moment to either go down a path where you're not, or ask a question or do something that evinces the fact that you are feeling some empathy.
And sales organizations in particular should really care about this. Technology is great when it is our servant. It's not great when it becomes our master. And I think in some situations, that's what we've done. And I was with a group of senior leaders this past week, one of whom tried to convince me. He's holding his phone up and waving it at me and saying, Jane, this is the future. And I said, you can't build relationships on your phone. And he said, yes, that's why we have emojis. Look at all the choices of emojis we get now. And I said, we are fundamentally wired to connect with people. And when you're in a room with a person and talking with them, your brain chemistry actually changes. That will never, ever, ever, ever happen over a phone. And so we have to start to understand there are certain times when you must be face-to-face with somebody, times when it's important to build trust, those kinds of situations. And so
but that's really interesting.
Pardon me?
Well, I was just going to interject. I mean, you bring up this point about times where you need to be face-to-face. So, I mean, we're seeing, obviously if not the most significant trend in sales over the last 5 years has been the migration toward more inside sales, especially as, the business model changes for certain industries where they start selling, on-premise software. We sell, subscription-based software, which is one of the key drivers of it, but other industries are adopting it as well. Increasingly people are not ever meeting their customers face to face.
Right. Well, and the statistics say that that, I don't remember what the percentage is. It's going to be in the double digits, where sales jobs will be lost in the next 10 years. And
blah, 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 blah is what I think. But
no,
anyway.
well, I don't disagree with that. But my reaction to that is, then the sales jobs that are left, B2B, those abilities of social intelligence will be even more important than they ever have been. Because the jobs that will be left will be jobs where you must be able to be in a room with a customer, understand how they're feeling, be a critical thinker, be able to think on your feet, be able to deal with conflict on your feet. So I think the jobs that will be left, there's an argument to be made that they will require more social intelligence than even before.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think what people need to sort of keep in mind is, one is, I think those Statista, Forrester, and other people have their studies. First of all, the Forrester study that came out in 2015 predicting what's going to happen in 2020 is already outdated, and it's not going to happen. So in terms of loss of sales jobs, there will be, inevitably, there'll be sales jobs that are lost, because at some lower tiers, there will be some level of automation, bots, whatever, AI that can handle some of that. But to your point, to the more complex tasks, I think that companies today that are thinking that the only way they can sell is through inside sales are going to come to understand that there are going to be companies in their space. They're going to say, look, we're going to go make a big difference. What we're going to do is get on an airplane and go see this customer. And if you're the only vendor that makes the effort to go see the customer, you're going to win the business.
Well, it's interesting. A lot of industries are getting away from that in ways that, maybe I'm just not smart, but I haven't thought of. I was in a serious car accident last week, and when I took my car to the repair shop, the woman told me that one of the big insurance companies is not having adjusters anymore. They're just counting on the body shop to take pictures and do all that work. And she said they're going to regret that. They will come back from that decision, because there are other things that happen in that encounter that are important. And so, everybody wants to embrace technology, and I agree with that 100%. But people that make the argument that, young people, Jane, this is how they communicate, and they're the future, so we have to adjust to them. Okay, to a certain point. On the other hand, that generation, I think we just talked about this, highest suicide rate since we've measured, highest rate of depression since we've ever measured, more anxiety than the generation in World War I. So that is reflective of technology and the inability, I shouldn't say the inability, the way that we don't build relationships on technology. We have friends, here come the air quotes again, that are, 800 friends with relationships that are 2 inches deep, right? We have no depth. We don't have deep conversations on technology because we're too lazy. Now we talk in emojis. We don't even use full sentences. So we're not building deep relationships. We're building brands online. How many people on Facebook do you see who say, my life just sucks? Nobody. Everybody's happy. Everybody's eating great, beautiful food, that's brand creation. That's not relationship building. And so the argument that that's just the way it's going and we need to embrace that, I push back on that, because it's not healthy to completely swing so far to the direction of technology. And I don't know if you've ever read any work by Sherry Turkle. She's an MIT professor who studied the effect of technology on young people since the 70s.
No, I've not read anything about her.
She's wonderful. She has a TED Talk, so that's an easy way to get to know her. She's fabulous. And that is impacting our young people in ways we cannot imagine. And so I think for business leaders or sales leaders to just say, this is just the way it's going, this is what our young people are forcing us to do, I think that's a cop-out. There are certain human things that we need to be able to do. And people coming into the workforce today don't have a lot of those skills. So guess what? It's up to you as a leader to fill that gap.
Yeah, well, I think that to that point is that, yeah, you may have portions of a generation, coming out and coming into the workforce and thinking that, some of these relational skills, just not as relevant, not as important, but they change. And, the thing that happens in business is, and sales is a perfect example of this, is that, we've got a whole generation of kids coming up that didn't make many phone calls, right? So they didn't have phone skills. And yet
Okay,
at the same time, they are also the generation that are, companies are building incredible sales engines on top of that are basically largely based on making phone calls and connecting with people. So to the point you were talking earlier, it's a learned skill and it can be learned. And I think what they're learning is that, oh yeah, this is important, but the way they're being taught is by the fact that it becomes a necessity, integral part of their work experiences. They have.
Well, what's interesting is I don't think most companies either haven't figured it out or they're not in enough pain. I don't know, because only 22% of companies are trying to solve this opportunity, right? Are trying to solve for, what do we do with this young workforce that is not engaged and is turning over at a rate of 3 years? So the math on that, to me, is a no-brainer, why we need to start investing in this age group. And, there are other things, but I think if we just start with the way we lead, understanding what it is that they require from us in terms of things like feedback, right, and coaching. So if we think about the way we lead and are willing to adjust the way we lead, if we are willing to identify what their skill gaps are that are different from what are traditional, right, from what you and I experienced when we were in the same situation, and solve for those skill gaps, you are a long way ahead of the majority of your competitors. So, and as I said to you earlier, we have to get out of our own way. We have a lot of biases about this age group that are not appropriate. And granted, there are some kind of odd conundrums about this group statistically. They have a high desire to be developed. One of the top 3 things that are important to the next generation. On the other hand, they don't really self-motivate around development. So they're kind of looking to us to figure that out for them. That doesn't mean I think we should. I think it needs to be a collaborative situation. But there are some kind of funky things about the next generation. And also, I think it's important to, I get some pushback from people sometimes saying, quit stereotyping. And it's not really a stereotype when it's statistically valid, right? So we can prove this about this generation. And I always go back to that Jack Welch model, that kind of 20% of superstars, that 60% in the middle and the 20% on the bottom. It falls the same way, right? There's that 20% of millennials that pop up at a keynote I give or something, and they go, Jane, I'm not like that at all. I believe you, right? But that 60%, that middle group, if we can move them a little bit, it will be dramatic for business. The difference will be dramatic. Their level of engagement will be dramatic. And we all know the math around disengaged employees and the stress on managers to have to fill that gap or take that job on while they're filling the gap. So to me, this is just common sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's a thing I think is sort of interesting is there's sort of panic mode to some degree in the way people sort of look at millennials and Gen Z that's coming after and so on is unmindful of the fact that these generations change, right? I mean, there's certain things that happen, but look at baby boomers, for instance. I mean, baby boomers coming, if you look what people said about them as a generation in the 60s and the 70s, and then what they said about them in the 80s and the 90s, they went from being counterculture to these are people that are fueling the greed rush on Wall Street.
Right.
and generations changed. These were the anti-Vietnam to, now millennials look at baby boomers and say, well, you were complicit in the ruination of our climate. What were you doing? So it's like, people need to understand that this is a problem. We need to address it as this skill gap as much as possible.
Yeah. But and I agree, every generation has been frowned upon by the one before them. To me, the big difference here is how technology has impacted.
Sure. Oh, absolutely.
That generation, right?
Yeah, in ways we never anticipated.
And they have been parented differently by the Gen Xers. That there are a lot of statistics on that, and we don't need to go into that. But they were parented differently. But by and large, I think technology is the biggest difference. And we did not. Well, I'll say you guys did not, because I don't have any children. Manage.
I'll take the ball.
I love to. That's my one finger pointing thing I can do right there. We didn't do a great job managing that use of technology, and we let it kind of run wild, and it's impacting our culture now in some interesting and not always positive ways. And the lack of empathy being one of those things. In England, they, in 2000, recently, I want to say 2010, they opened an empathy museum. Mm-hmm. That's an interesting commentary, isn't it? I always thought museums were for artifacts. I hope empathy hasn't become an artifact.
Yeah, I don't think it is, but it's. Yeah, this isn't. I know this. We sort of strayed a little bit from sales per se, but I mean, this does relate to it. But it's, you look at this whole idea about use of technology and so on is it's important to keep in mind is where we stand today. Is that the smartphone's only 10 years old. So a lot of these millennials, you talk about millennials, the forward edge being 35. They were 25 when the smartphone came out.
Yeah.
So it's one of these things like you say, well, yeah, technology's had an impact maybe on the younger ones, maybe even some of the older ones. It certainly had an impact on us, even as people have been around for a bit longer. And I bet you if you wanted to do studies, you find that's probably changed the nature of the relationships we have with people and the way we form as well. I think it's affecting us all in ways we aren't aware of. But I guess the point I was making is it's happening so quickly that we're we don't have the ability to anticipate and to predict what's going to happen, and we know that I was trying to remember the famous quote from what was the guy's name? Amara's Law, Roy Amara. He said, we tend to overestimate the effect of technology in the short run and underestimate the effect in the long run.
That's insightful.
And I think that's something really important to keep in mind as we come up with solutions with these skill gaps that we find, or these just human gaps that we're finding.
And I think in terms of, I think it's as relevant or more relevant to sales organizations than anybody else. I think this is an amazing generation, and the challenge for leaders is, am I willing to adjust the way I lead to effectively harness the power of these young people? And it requires some adjustment. And, people don't like change, and leaders, we grew up in an environment where you do what I say because my business card says I have a better title than you, or my office has a window, whatever that is. And we have to get past that. I told these leaders last week, the sandwich is dead. Where you say something nice, give the negative feedback, and then wrap up with something nice. The sandwich is not effective. for feedback anymore. You've got to learn as a leader to be a coach. You've got to learn to enable the power of the question. You've got to be great at asking questions. And for sales leaders, we should be great at asking questions. That's what great salespeople do. Well, so this should be, this one thing anyway, should be something that would be an easy transition for sales leaders. But what I find is that leaders in particular, they just struggle with a different way. They push back and they go, Jane, I was giving this feedback because I care and I want them to be better. And I was really nice about it. And they got all offended, or they got worked up, or they cried, or whatever it is. And it's not so much about your intent. That's only half of the equation. You've got to understand how to communicate to a younger generation that's never dealt with that kind of face-to-face conflict. And create some self-awareness.
Sure.
So we've got to be great question askers.
Yeah, I just sort of in wrapping up, to me, I think one of the fascinating things for, we could say for a future discussion and for people listening to think about is that we could talk about this for another 5 years, and at that point, the leaders are the millennials, and
well, actually, the 35 that I was with last week, 8 of them were millennials.
Yeah, so I mean, it's happening very quickly, and so I think one of the more pressing issues for us to think about and to contemplate is that if there are these skill gaps that exist just on a human level, regardless of the role that you fulfill, is that once you move into management and you still have those, and then you have to deal with people, leading a team of people that are looking up to you for leadership, it magnifies the problem, if not multiplies it. So it is important that people think about this concept of, love the expression Colvin used in his book, humans, we have to become more intensely human.
Yeah.
And I think that's really a goal.
Managers are some of the least developed employees in organizations. And so we haven't equipped them to be leaders by and large. We've asked them to manage tactics, or sales managers, we've asked them to manage to the number. But development of leaders across the board, they're one of the most underdeveloped groups in business. And so, they've got this situation and they know that they're in a situation, but we haven't equipped them to know what to do about it. And that needs to be our first line of defense, not doing what a lot of clients say to me is, can you help me fix the millennials? No,
Yeah.
A, they're not broken. And B, it never starts there. It always starts with leaders.
I agree. All right. Well, Jane, good stuff. So tell folks how they can find out more about what you're doing and connect with you.
You can follow me on LinkedIn, Jane Gentry 1, I think. Look up Jane Gentry, you'll find me. You can follow me on Twitter at Jane Gentry. You can check out our website at www.janegentry.com. And I am a relationship person, so I love to engage with people in any of those forums, or even crazily enough on the phone. So yeah, that's what they can do. And I love to talk about this topic. I love talking about this topic with sales leaders, among other things that we do well. But I think this is timely.
Good. Well, Jane, thank you very much. And,
thank you.
It's been a pleasure. And friends, thank you for spending this time with us today. Make sure you come back, join us again for the next great episode of Accelerate. Until then, I appreciate if you get a chance, go to iTunes, subscribe to this podcast. And if you haven't done so already, please do. Leave us a review. We want to hear what we can do to make this an even more valuable experience for you. So thanks again for joining me. Until next time, this is Andy Paul. Good selling, everyone.